Hi, how are you? My name is Daniel Aldana Cohen. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where I also direct the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative. I'm going to talk today about the idea of a Green New Deal for public housing and seeing that as a kind of essential piece of a broader green stimulus, in some ways as a microcosm of the goals of green stimulus or even the Green New Deal, depending on how you want to frame this. I, along with a number of others, wrote a letter to Congress this past spring calling for a green stimulus to rebuild the economy. The idea is that we were facing kind of three major crises: crisis of economic catastrophe, which is particularly affecting workers and communities of color, public health crisis, of course, COVID-19, and the climate crisis, the climate emergency, and the need to dramatically reduce carbon emissions and also make people safer from extreme weather. So we still need green stimulus. And the question is, more specifically, what are some of the projects going to look like more concretely that deliver all those aims? I think we're at the stage now where we want to move beyond big sweeping principles and get a bit more granular. And that's why I'm going to focus on the Green New Deal for public housing idea today, although one could go through any number of ideas in our green stimulus proposal, or indeed in any number of Green New Deal or green stimulus proposals. And ideally also bring that same level of richness in detail, that kind of holistic analysis. I've been researching housing and climate change since 2010, so this tells you a little bit about my bias, why I see housing as so important, but I'll give you a lot more reasons than my own biography in a minute to see these connections. 5 kind of takeaways, just to lay out in advance of what I'm gonna argue. We need to cut energy demand overall. Because unless we use less energy, it will just take forever to replace fossil fuels with renewables. But we also have to abolish specific demand for fossil gas. So for example, gas-fired appliances in our homes. We need to tackle carbon pollution and the social need for decent housing at the same time, I think, and this proposal tries to do that. Make the case that we can leverage public assets for green economic development more broadly, so that when we're doing a Green New Deal for public housing, we're actually laying the groundwork for a far broader transformation of the building sector all across the country. We can do this by building on the best models from Europe, from Canada, and indeed some cases within the US. And finally, like I think any good progressive policy, we're connecting to fighting social movements who are also fighting for green investment and who are also fighting for housing needs. So that this isn't just an abstraction floating down from above from the University of Pennsylvania, but is indeed a living campaign that we can hope to win. So this past November, I led the research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, which was introduced in Congress by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, had some co-sponsors like Elizabeth Warren. So I led this research process, but with many colleagues at Penn and the McHarg Center. I direct SC2 Data for Progress. I'll talk a little bit more about NYCHA, which is New York City Housing Authority public housing, where we got into a little bit more granularity and depth, because that's where so much of the country's public housing is. But close to 500,000 residents in New York public housing. That's close to a quarter of the national population. But again, this should apply to other parts of the country, of course, including Philadelphia, where a lot of the public housing here is under threat of demolition. So let's just take a step back before we dive back into housing. We need to cut carbon pollution, right? We are in a planetary emergency, and we need to be at the very lowest lines here, just immediately slashing emissions. So we have to find ways to cut carbon pollution throughout the entire economy. We can't just go step by step, but we have to kind of go everywhere, and therefore look for the intersections of where carbon pollution exists in kind of everyday life and tackle it there. Housing alone causes about 15% of US carbon emissions. That's almost 1/6 of carbon emissions come from housing. From, on the one hand, the electricity that goes into the housing, if it's sourced from a coal plant or natural gas plant, and on the other hand, from the gas-fired appliances inside of that housing. And then if you throw in commercial buildings, that gets you to close to 1/3 of emissions. So this is serious business. We have to find a way to decarbonize buildings. We have to find a way to decarbonize housing. Housing is also a place where the energy crisis the climate crisis, and then the housing affordability crisis all converge. If you look at private market housing, 1 in 3 households is suffering from energy insecurity. It means they reduced spending on basic necessities to pay the bills. So for example, spending less money on food to cover the gas bill. They got a disconnection notice from the utility, or they kept their home at an unhealthy temperature, right? This is 1/3 of US households in this situation. In the mid-Atlantic, half of Black households are suffering from energy insecurity. So we need tools to really dramatically reduce energy use in low-income homes, in some cases cover the cost of energy for those low-income households. And of course, this is a great opportunity to then also electrify those homes, reduce energy demand, and eliminate and abolish fossil gas demand. Now, the most inefficient housing stock in the entire country is public housing. So that would be a great place to start dealing with some of those energy needs. And public housing is also a public asset. So we can directly invest in public housing and have a lot more control of the retrofit of public housing than almost any other category. So it's not the only place we should invest by any means, but it is a very strategic place to start investing. The public housing stock is also in need of investments, not just for energy, but just repairs in general. There is tens and tens of billions of dollars of backlog in public housing conditions. So let's say we look at public housing in New York City and just compare the conditions of that housing to the average conditions in New York City. NYCHA, which is the public housing in New York City, is disproportionately far, far, far more Black and more Puerto Rican and more Hispanic than the rest of the city is. Its residents are far more likely, over twice as likely, to be in fair or poor health than the New York City average. Why is that? Well, the rate of water leakage is more than twice as high in public housing in New York. The rate of toilet breakdown is nearly twice as high. The rate of heating breakdown is well over twice as high. The rate of cockroach infestation is well over twice as high. This is the result of long-term government neglect of the public housing in New York. Later, we'll talk about what some of the social housing looks like in Europe. It's a spectacular condition in many cases. But in the United States, we've dramatically neglected public housing. And so if we want to talk about dealing with the massive health crisis in public housing, if we want to talk about the just crisis of disrepair in public housing, why not combine that with investments that will also tackle carbon emissions? That's what the Green New Deal for public housing is fundamentally about. A model of whole building, holistic retrofits that are going to deliver in terms of improving conditions and are going to cut carbon pollution. Let me just take you through some of the results from our research, estimates of the benefits of a holistic public investment to do green retrofits in all of the public housing in New York City and indeed around the country. But first, let's again note, where are these public housing communities? Well, in New York City, as we saw, they were very much communities of color. They're also communities that have high rates of unemployment, and where injecting funds for green jobs would have a massive economic benefit. Remember, we also want to tackle the crisis of unemployment and of poverty. And here's some examples. And if you look around the country, we find the same thing. If we look at cities all around the country, and the same is true for Philly, although I don't have that map up for you here, again, we find public housing is located in communities with high unemployment. And that's not just true actually in urban areas. About 1/3 of public housing residents nationally are white. Quite a few of them live in rural areas. And so if we look at, for instance, at Alabama, you have quite a bit of public housing in areas that are relatively white, but they are also areas that have very high levels of unemployment. So making jobs, doing green retrofits of public housing is not just going to benefit urban areas and not just going to benefit communities of color, which need those benefits, but will also benefit working class white communities, and in particular, rural working class white communities. So if you look just at NYCHA, we're talking about a proposed $50 billion investment over the course of 10 years. And what we're proposing is, again, creating healthy, safe, comfortable homes, thousands and thousands of union construction jobs, jobs and business opportunities for residents of public housing, investing in communities of color, creating resiliency centers out of that public housing. We want to abolish, again, carbon pollution, right? So it's really a vision of community transformation that builds out of public housing. One of the things we want to do, of course, is insulate this housing and provide electric heat pump and HVAC systems. That's how we're going to decarbonize them. We're going to make these all electric buildings, and we're going to make them much, much, much more energy efficient. Based on models from around the world, we're talking about reducing energy use by between 30 and 75%. And we're eliminating any need for fossil fuels in those buildings. But in the process of doing this, again, following best practices from around the world, we are also going to make the units, the apartments, far more healthy and comfortable. So again, this is going to take a lot of work. We're going to create a lot of jobs. And through the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, there are stipulations so that about 3/4 of the jobs over the course of 10 years would go to residents of public housing or low-income workers in that broad neighborhood. That's thanks to something called Section 3 in the HUD regulations, which is a whole other matter we don't need to get into today. We are going to abolish the carbon pollution. By doing this, we're going to go full electrification, and in this bill, the public housing units would then buy their energy from 100% renewable sources. That would be the equivalent in New York City alone of taking 500,000 cars off the road every year. Nationally, it's the equivalent of taking over 1.2 million cars off the road every single year. And by the way, when we're doing these retrofits, we're then freeing up money for maintenance long-term. We're talking about cutting water bills by about 30%, or 97 million a year nationally, and reducing energy bills by 70%, based on expected energy savings, or $613 million every year. So substantial savings in public housing that are a result of deep energy retrofits, deep, green, healthy, holistic retrofits. If you look at health impacts, if we just study the, sort of look at the research on mold and asthma, leads us to estimate that if we got rid of all the mold from New York City public housing, we could reduce the rate of asthma among NYCHA residents by between 18 and 30%. And I would note something that I think is not often known. Just the heat pump technology that we would use for the HVAC system is able to dehumidify air. And in fact, in Toronto community housing, where they're doing these retrofits, the dehumidification benefit in the summer is probably the single most popular element of the housing retrofits that they have reported in Toronto. And again, this has a very serious health benefit. It reduces the root cause of mold. So not only are you going to go in and get rid of the mold that's there, but you're going to prevent new molds from coming. And that's going to be very good for the health of residents. And indeed, overall, again, what we're talking about is a great climate benefit, but at the same time, we are creating modern, healthy, comfortable public housing apartments. And indeed, the idea is through these retrofits to create housing so good that anybody would be happy to live there. I want to note quickly as well that based on our economic modeling, well over, or sort of a majority of the jobs that would be created through this whole process would actually, just looking at construction and maintenance jobs, would occur in red states rather than in blue states. It's very dramatic if you include New York, which has so much public housing as in New York City. But actually, even if you throw New York back in, you still find more jobs created in red states than in blue states through this public housing, Green New Deal for public housing. So I've made a sort of series of these just broad, almost like what might sound to you like science fiction claims, like, oh, we're just going to pass this law and do these retrofits and everything is going to be incredible and amazing. And why should you believe me? It's a good question. Why should you believe me? But the truth is that we're building on best practices that already exist. And in fact, if you yourself are asking yourself, why should I believe this idea that with a massive public investment, we can just make this public housing so beautiful? I think ask yourself, what is it about US politics that makes you think that way? That's a very specific reaction, right? The idea that I think many of us have is just a skepticism that one could really make public housing beautiful and green, right? We're led to believe that greening is really something that has to do with affluence, with the middle class, the upper class. It's a luxury amenity, right? But we have to deprogram ourselves to some extent. And one way to do that is to look around the world. You'll see here a picture from a piece in The Guardian about the Grand Parc in Bordeaux. So there's a public housing complex in Bordeaux that was renovated a couple of years ago. And the renovation was so spectacular that that renovation actually won the Mies van der Rohe Award for greatest, essentially, architectural achievement in the European Union in 2019. Right, so Mies van der Rohe is well known for designing modernist, beautiful skyscrapers all over the world. And the award in his name was given in the European Union last year to a public housing retrofit in Bordeaux, France. And I'd encourage you to look up the article. There's a short video of what they did to the housing units. It's absolutely extraordinary, plus carbon emissions. And by the way, an earlier iteration of this retrofitting style that they did in Bordeaux was done in Paris, and actually written up in the New York Times by the architecture critic there almost 10 years ago. So this is known. You know, we know that this is happening. It's just not being done in the US. There is one exception, a very successful housing retrofit with a huge amount of leadership from the Tenants Association in Boston's Castle Square public housing complex, funded by the Obama 2009 stimulus. Big success, cut energy emissions roughly in half, and massive modernization of apartments, new kitchens, really great situation for the residents there. So even in the US, we have one example of not quite as spectacular aesthetically as we saw in France, but a very successful green retrofit and upgrade to the public housing there. And actually Bloomberg just did a story on this a few weeks ago, and the tenant association leader who was so integral to that process said, you know, we had one really big regret with this green retrofit. And our regret was it only happened in our housing complex. It hasn't yet happened to other low-income housing all around the city. So this is very much something that, although most spectacular in Europe, can happen in the US. The vision of the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act is that we would also begin to construct new green social housing to the highest standards of energy efficiency. And there too, we can look around and say, you know what, this is actually not science fiction, this is reality. In the United Kingdom last year, the Sterling Architecture Prize, major national architecture prize, goes to passive house standard, extremely energy efficient, virtually zero energy, public housing, they call it council housing, in Norwich. And indeed, it's built, as you can see, at the kind of townhouse scale. So it's not the case that we have to only build towers. In Philly, you could be building a lot of new green social housing that uses virtually no energy, entirely electric. And in fact, Philly is a plausible place to do that, because in Pennsylvania already, largely in Pittsburgh, but to some extent in Philly, we have already learned how to make affordable housing through this tax credit program. So it's not quite public housing, but it's affordable housing in Pennsylvania. It can now be constructed with at the same cost as using conventional methods. But at that cost, we can also make passive house public housing, affordable housing rather. Way cheaper to operate because it uses virtually no energy. And it's healthier to live in. So already in Pennsylvania, we are learning to make affordable housing for the same upfront cost, making green affordable housing, super efficient affordable housing at the same upfront cost as the more conventional building standards, which are much less efficient in terms of energy. So again, we're on the verge here. We're on the verge in the US of an explosion in green affordable housing, just as we are seeing in Europe. In Europe, it's winning the top prizes. It could in the United States as well. This is not science fiction. This is reality. There's also an issue of kind of, you'd almost sort of say business model, or let's say project management techniques. Like, how are we actually going to make this happen? And then how do we get it from just being about public housing to the broader economy? So there's a program in Europe called the Energiesprong. It comes out of Holland. It's arrived in the US in some form in New York and California. And the idea is very simple. You use public subsidy to retrofit affordable housing, public housing, and other low-income housing. And as you do that, you will bring down the price of the materials. You're going to develop the capacities of workers, develop the capacities of worker co-ops even, develop the capacities of companies. And that will then allow those new companies and skills and materials to be used at much lower cost throughout the rest of the economy. So that what you do with a subsidy for public housing can then be done in a market rate apartment tower just 3 or 4 years later at a cost that is minimal and that will pay itself back just in a few years from energy savings. So the idea, again, is that we build up the industry through subsidized retrofits, right? Where the government pays for the retrofits, subsidizes them, as we're proposing with the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, and those skills and capabilities and technologies and materials then spread through the rest of the economy. And indeed, thanks to this, in Europe right now, they're far advanced compared to the US, 5 to 10 years ahead in green building technology, even manufacturing appliances like heat pumps for large buildings, which we still don't build in the United States, but could. In Toronto, we have something called the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, which has also likewise started with green, healthy retrofits of public housing. There they call it community housing. And then they're using those techniques and technologies now to spread through other large buildings in Toronto. And the Toronto Atmospheric Fund has been a big inspiration for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, because in Toronto, what they do is they always go in and do retrofits. They do stuff to the kitchen, let's say, to make it healthy, to pull out the mold, and the energy efficiency stuff at the same time. So they're kind of teaching us in the US what the specific project management techniques are, so that you're not really bothering the resident. They don't have to go live somewhere else for a few months, and you're delivering a climate benefit and a health benefit and an economic benefit all at the same time, right? So again, this stuff is not science fiction. This stuff is happening around the world. It's happening in Canada. We can look also to places like Vienna. I think if we look, in my mind, to a kind of slightly more distant future, where in Vienna, 1/3 of the housing is public, like this housing here, the Alt-Erla complex. 1/3 of the housing is cooperative. I took this picture myself in the midst of a cooperative housing complex in Vienna. We can here in the United States as well start to move towards that vision where social housing, cooperative housing, non-market housing is really a public option. It's housing that anybody would be happy to live in, and it will raise the bar for the private market as well, both in terms of affordability and quality, and also in terms of environmental performance. Finally, when we think about the green stimulus in Europe, what are they saying actually, or the European Green Deal? It's not as good as the Green New Deal, but it's something. They are saying housing renovations will be at the core of any kind of Green Deal in Europe. And when they talk about a green stimulus in Europe, they see home energy retrofits as being at the absolute core of that program, for the same reasons I've talked about, because it's going to deliver health benefits. It's going to deliver economic benefits for the residents. It's going to reduce energy use overall. It's going to eliminate the need for fossil gas. It just makes a huge amount of sense, right? Remember, if you reduce energy use overall by 50% in a large apartment complex, right? That's, instead of having to build 30 solar panels to service that building, now you only have to build 15. You're going to get there faster, right? The economic and climate benefits of reducing energy demand and then electrifying whatever energy is left, that's really big. It's also good for indoor air quality. You're not burning little fires inside of your own homes. You're simply flicking on a switch, which is plugged into the sun or which is plugged into the wind. So again, not science fiction, as a hard-nosed economic development strategy. Again, this is all the rage in the European Union. And we should, I think, really consider home energy efficiency retrofits, green, healthy retrofits, as being at the core of a green stimulus of an economic recovery here in the US. So it's a story of economic development, right? It's a story of economic development, of upgrading infrastructure, of upgrading the skills of workers, bringing companies on board that are going to really play a huge role in the green building economy all across the economy. It starts with public housing in this vision, not just public housing, but public housing is one center. We could also think about schools, think about libraries, and then it's going to spread throughout the whole economy. Public housing, again, is a great way to lead because it's a public institution we already have. So we can just simply directly invest through grants in those retrofits. And then we know that those skills, those practices are going to spread through the economy. I'm running tight on time, so I'll just say very briefly, we have even seen in the US an example of this with NYCHA, with New York Public Housing, partnered with the New York Power Authority, which is a public utility in the 90s, to create the first energy efficient fridges in the country. Were actually done through a partnership of Maytag, public housing, and public utility. And now the Energy Star apartment size fridge that every American has the chance to buy and save energy on, that actually comes out of a program led by NYCHA, by public housing. And we're suggesting we could do the same again now for things like electric induction stoves. Apartment size, low cost, super efficient electric induction stoves. If we bought 1 million of those, one for every unit of public housing in the country, that would dramatically bring down costs for consumers in the private market for everybody else, right? Simply by using public housing as leverage to kind of transform the market. We've done it before with fridges. We can do it again with electric induction stoves, which are far, far better than the current electric stoves that you're probably used to, but the new induction stoves are the kind of world-class cooking experience. We found great support from the public for this idea. With public polling through Data for Progress, the public is especially excited about apprenticeship programs to bring union jobs into public housing. They're especially excited about the health improvements, removing molds, removing lead from public housing, which is great. the American public has a real appetite for improving lives of public housing residents. Again, this is, I'm sure, going to keep seeming to you like pushing the bounds of possibility. But now remember that Joe Biden himself, this is from his campaign website, he's promising a $2 trillion green stimulus, $2 trillion green stimulus in the next 4 years. And he said that 40% of that funding, of the benefits from that spending, has to go to frontline communities, right? Frontline communities, disadvantaged communities. What does that mean? Well, public housing residents are disadvantaged, right? So we've estimated that to do every single public housing unit in the country could cost between 120 and 170 billion over 10 years. That easily fits within the 800 billion, 40% of 2 trillion. That easily fits within the budget of what Biden has promised for the next 4 years. But even if we do something more modest than every single unit, even if we don't go to the full luxury level, the idea that we would spend substantially on public housing retrofits and that we could afford that within the scope of what Joe Biden has promised, it's there. Indeed, Biden has specifically promised to build new green social housing. And elsewhere in his plan, I'm not going to give you the entire plan on this website, he has promised to retrofit millions of homes in his first term. So the idea that, in our political reality, under a President Joe Biden, hopefully we will defeat Trump and not have a climate denialist in the White House. The idea that under President Biden, you could have this spectacular increase in investment in public housing, which would then have other further kind of cascading benefits throughout the housing sector. That idea is not crazy. That idea is actually literally already at joebiden.com. This builds actually on momentum from housing movements. Housing movements in New York actually played a fundamental role in getting that city to pass the country's most aggressive low carbon buildings bill, Local Law 97. And we've seen groups like People's Action, and full disclosure, I'm on the policy team. People's Action, their Homes Guarantee campaign, maybe the most dynamic housing campaign nationally in the country, they have worked very hard to integrate the idea of the Green New Deal with the idea of a homes guarantee. So we're talking about a kind of pincer movement in a way. On the one hand, the Biden campaign recognizing the economic, the health, and the climate logic of investing in green, affordable housing in various ways. And then coming up from below, you have radical housing movements all across the country, movements of tenants demanding the same thing. They're saying that's what we want. We want our housing agenda, the right to housing, to come in a green way, right? We want to live in a healthy housing, in clean housing, and comfortable housing. We want to live in housing that contributes to the fight against climate change. So with the kind of technological capabilities we now have to do this, with the political momentum that we are building, I would just say, let's do this. Let's have a green stimulus. And let's note, again, that when you hear people talk about the Green New Deal, or you hear people talk about a green stimulus, and it sounds abstract and big picture, and it sounds just like so far over the horizon of pragmatism, so far over the horizon of possibility, that's not the case. When you break down that really big idea into its component parts, you will find ideas like the Green New Deal for public housing, which are very concrete, which respond to the demands of people on the ground, which simply accelerate and scale up the best practices that we already have around the world and in the United States. We simply need the political mobilization to make this happen, to force this through. So I'm super excited about this, this policy approach. I'm excited more broadly about the idea of a green stimulus. There's a ton of terrible things going on in this country, but I think we're closer to solutions than we realize. So thanks so much for hanging out with me virtually and asynchronously in this presentation, and we'll look forward to getting any questions and all the virtual conversations that I'm sure will follow. Thanks very much. Take care.